Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Victober video. And today I'm going to be taking you through 70 must-read Victorian novels. So, over the past few weeks, I have been compiling a list of must-read Victorian novels. I'm putting must-read in air quotations because, you know, what does must-read mean anyway? Basically, my thought behind this video is that it might be a useful exercise for me and also a useful checklist for someone else if I were to make a list of 50 Victorian books that I considered important or worth reading or sort of worth your time. And my idea was that this list would be not a subjective list of my favourite 50 Victorian books, but a more kind of objective look at Victorian literature, picking books from different genres and different styles, books from a variety of authors looking at a variety of themes, books that are sort of important in terms of literary history, but also might be a good example of a particular kind of Victorian book, and books that feel sort of representative of Victorian literature as a whole. And my idea was that this would be, yeah, like I said, a more objective list. You know, there will be some books on this list that I don't personally like that much, but that I think are worth trying. I thought I would just keep it to novels because I find it quite hard to compare you know, poetry and novels, and I'm also much sort of less well read in Victorian non-fiction, say. So I thought we'd just keep it to novels. Where I have drawn the line between a novel and a novella is debatable. I have decided that Cranford is long enough, but I've decided that A Christmas Carol is not long enough. But whether or not I've accidentally included something that's actually shorter than A Christmas Carol, I don't know. Take this with a pinch of salt. I thought this might be a fun exercise and fun video rather than, you know, a be-all and end-all list. I also, as I said, intended for this to be a list of 50, and it is a list of 70 because I just couldn't narrow it down any further. 70 books is obviously quite a lot to speak about in one video, so I think I'm probably going to split this video into two, and we will have 35 books today and 35 books whenever my next video is up. As I said, I've tried to be as objective as possible, and I wanted to have a mix of like important, well-known, highly regarded Victorian books and some fascinating forgotten Victorian novels that give like a window into a particular point in Victorian history. I've also tried to limit how many books I have per author, although narrowing down authors who I've read an awful lot from was very, very difficult. Is this list still influenced by my own biases? Yes, of course. Dickens does have more novels on this list than any other author. And is that because he's arguably the most important Victorian novelist, or is it because he's my favourite? It's probably the latter. But, you know, I have deigned to put my nemesis, George Eliot, on here, and I have limited myself to just 2 novels by Anthony Trollope out of the 42 I have read, and I hope you know that that hurt my soul. I'm sure there will end up being some obvious omissions. I'm sure there will be some significant books that I have missed, and I am limited by what I have read. I've only put books on this list that I have read myself and feel qualified to talk about. There are some important Victorian books that I haven't read yet, but I think this will still hopefully be an interesting and useful list. Also, before I begin, if you're interested in Victorian literature and in finding out about more Victorian authors, I also did a series last October called 100 Victorian Authors, when I went through 100 different Victorian authors and talked about them. And they weren't all authors I'd read from, so that is a much, much bigger, broader list spread across an awful lot of videos with a lot more detail. So do go and look at that too if you're interested in learning about more Victorian authors. Okay, that was an unnecessarily long introduction with more disclaimers than I possibly needed, but let's get into my list. I have ordered this just alphabetically by author. That seemed easier to me. I'm going to start at the beginning with The Notting Hill Mystery by Charles Warren Adams. The Notting Hill Mystery is an early detective novel, arguably the first detective novel in English literature, but there are several books that claim to be that, so take that with a pinch of salt. It's also an interesting novel in that it plays with form, using various letters and diary entries, and all of these kind of sources and pieces of evidence are kind of used together to build a picture of a crime. It's an interesting book to read as an early detective novel because you basically know what happened from the start and how the murder occurred, and the book is kind of about proving it. So not like a top favourite of mine, but definitely one that is worth a read, especially if you're interested in detective fiction. Next, I have Lorna Doone, a historical novel about 2 feuding families and what happens when 2 people from these 2 very, very different families fall in love. It's a Romeo and Juliet kind of story that is really, really exciting and dramatic, and one I would recommend actually if you like Wuthering Heights. I have not read Lorna Doone for a very long time, but I really enjoyed it when I did, and it's really worth your time. Next, I have Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a wonderful sensation novel, really dramatic and pacey and fascinating, about a woman called Lady Audley who has a secret in her past. We're chiefly following Robert Audley, who's a relation of hers by marriage, as he tries to get to the bottom of what Lady Audley's secret is. It's a really, really great read and a perfect example of the Victorian sensation novel. Next, we have the Brontes. I really ummed and ahed about which Bronte novels to include in this list. At one point, I only had one novel by each Bronte sister, and then I added some others back in because the Bronte sisters are incredibly important figures within Victorian literary history, and all three of them were fantastic writers. So first on my list of 70, we have Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, the tale of a governess, her difficult working life and her strained relationship with her employers. I think this is a really wonderful novel for what it tells you about the Victorian education system, about women working in the Victorian period, and about the position of the governess. But I also had to include Anne Bronte's other novel, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, a wonderful novel told in two perspectives. We're following a young man and what happens when he meets a mysterious widow who seems to have some secrets in her past. And it turns into this incredible proto-feminist work examining the difficulties of marriage for women in the Victorian period, looking at alcoholism in a really complex way, looking at art and friendship and love and so much more. I love The Tenant of Wildfell Hall so much, and it had to be on this list. And then I have 3 out of Charlotte Bronte's 4 novels. Unless you are a Charlotte Bronte completionist, I don't especially recommend reading The Professor, but I do recommend her other 3 books. Jane Eyre is a fantastic novel about a governess who takes on a new position at Thornfield Hall. She finds herself working for a man called Mr. Rochester, who she is increasingly drawn towards, but there is clearly something happening at Thornfield Hall that she doesn't fully understand. Jane Eyre is a fantastic buildings romance. It's a wonderful coming-of-age story, and Jane as a character is just so complexly and fully developed. I love Jane Eyre so much. It's the book that got me into Victorian literature as a teenager, and I think it is a must-read if you are interested in Victorian literature. But Charlotte Bronte's second novel, Shirley, is also fascinating. It's a historical novel set during the early 19th century, looking at friendship and love and the position of women, looking at manufacturing in the early 19th century and how technological changes created a lot of tension. I'm about to reread Shirley and I'm really looking forward to it. But I also had to include Villette, which follows Lucy Snow as she travels from England to Belgium to become a teacher. There are so many things I love about Villette. I love how it is not the story you expect it to be, how the plot goes in different directions, and I love how the book looks at mental health and depression. For me, Villette is really a book about depression, and through a lot of the book, Lucy Snow is deeply, deeply unhappy, deeply lonely, deeply isolated, and the way the book looks at that in a really psychologically complex way is just fascinating. And now we come to Emily Bronte and her masterpiece Wuthering Heights. I love this book so much. It is a story within a story set over decades, exploring the tensions between 2 families, the Earnshaws and the Lyttons, and what happens when a little boy called Heathcliff is adopted into one family and disrupts everything. Many people will tell you that Wuthering Heights is a love story, but in my opinion, it is a revenge novel, and what a fantastic revenge novel it is. It's not for everyone. All of the characters are kind of awful, but it is an absolute masterpiece in storytelling, and the complexity of the narrative technique and the vividness of the characters is just absolutely incredible. Next, I have Night and Morning by Edward Bulwer Lytton. This is the only book by Bulwer Lytton that I have read, and when I have read more by him, maybe I would pick a different book to go on this list, I don't know, but I wanted to include Night and Morning because I do really think it's worth a read. It's a buildings romance about a boy whose parents were married in secret, and after his father's death, people don't believe that he is legitimate and don't believe that he is his father's legitimate heir. This means he is thrown into poverty and has to make his way in the world, and we follow him throughout his life. This book has some sort of revenge novel elements to it, which I think work really well, but it's also a really interesting book in its social criticism and the way that it looks at the stigma around illegitimacy in the Victorian period. Next on my list, I have Erewhon by Samuel Butler. This is not my favourite book, but I think it's historically fascinating, and I think if you're interested in dystopian, utopian fiction, thought experiments, then this is really worth your time. It is a novel masquerading as a travel book about a man who is in either Australia or New Zealand, I can't quite remember, when he stumbles across this forgotten kingdom where people have different rules. And what follows is a satire criticising certain elements of Victorian culture while kind of going on interesting thought experiments about various other things. Erewhon is a strange book. It doesn't have a plot. It's not going to be for everyone, but it is a fascinating example of a particular kind of novel from the Victorian period. Next, I have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, which probably needs no introduction. This is a children's book in which a little girl called Alice ends up going into another world where everything is very strange. It is a nonsense book, and it is really weird and surprisingly dark, but definitely worth your time. And especially worth your time because it's one of those Victorian books that has quite a big place in popular culture, but the actual book is in some ways similar and in some ways different from its place in popular culture, so it's worth reading the original just out of curiosity for that. Next, we have another very significant Victorian writer, Wilkie Collins, who was a really important figure within sensation novels. He wrote twisty-turny sensation novels full of drama and scandal and sometimes full of detection and mystery. I think you can see the seeds of sort of modern crime thrillers in a lot of Wilkie Collins books. I also think he does really interesting things with form, and that's another reason that it's worth reading his books, but anyway, I have picked 4 books by Wilkie Collins, and I found this very hard to narrow down because he wrote a lot and I have read quite a lot, and a lot of his books are fascinating, but here we go. As I said, I've picked out 4. So one of them is The Woman in White, a really fantastic gothic mystery told through the perspective of various different characters, all about the events that follow the mysterious meeting between an unknown woman in white and an art teacher who meet one night on the road. There's a lot that I love about The Woman in White: the shifts in narrative voice, the themes of marriage and cruelty within marriage, the truly amazing villain. There are so many reasons to read The Woman in White. I also wanted to include Armadale, which I think is a slightly overlooked and really fantastic Wilkie Collins novel, looking at the intertwined lives of 2 men with the same name, one of whom is white and one of whom is mixed race. And within Armadale, Wilkie Collins looks at the experience of being a person of colour who is white passing most of the time in Victorian Britain, which is something you just don't see explored in that many Victorian novels. There are so many reasons to read Armadale. The characterisation is fantastic, the plotting is really interesting, and it's just quite a different Victorian book, so definitely one I would recommend. But I also had to include The Moonstone, a detective story about the disappearance of a valuable diamond told from a lot of different perspectives. The use of narrative voice in The Moonstone is just fantastic, but I also think it has a lot of really interesting themes. It's one of those Victorian novels that is both really anti-imperialist and also like very rooted in the time it was written, but that makes it a really historically fascinating book, and it's also a really important work in the history of detective fiction and the development of the mystery novel, so I would really recommend The Moonstone. It is a must-read Victorian book. But I also had to include a 4th Wilkie Collins novel, and that is Man and Wife. Man and Wife is a fascinating, again slightly underrated Wilkie Collins novel that I would really recommend. The themes in this book and the way that it looks at marriage and the complexities of marriage within the Victorian period and the inequality between men and women when it came to marriage in the Victorian period is fascinating. Also, it contains one of the single best villains I have ever read in any novel ever, and it's worth reading Man and Wife just for that. It's so gripping and so tense and so truly wonderful, and I feel like it doesn't get read as much as The Moonstone or The Woman in White or even Armadale, so I wanted to include that on this list too. Yes, I have slightly indulged myself with 4 Wilkie Collins novels, but there we go. Next, I have A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the first Sherlock Holmes book, the introduction of the very famous characters Sherlock Holmes and John Watson and their first mystery together. A Study in Scarlet is not my favourite thing by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In general, I much prefer the Sherlock Holmes short stories to the novels, but A Study in Scarlet is fascinating and important as the introduction of Holmes and Watson, who are both such important characters, and Sherlock Holmes especially, you know, arguably the most famous, the most important character from Victorian literature. Possibly. You know, I just said Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is significant in popular culture today, but Sherlock Holmes is so much more so. A Study in Scarlet is a slightly odd book because there is a big section in it where we're transported to another place and to different characters in order to work out the background of the mystery that Holmes and Watson are solving. That's a bit strange, but you know, it's still the first time that Sherlock Holmes appeared in fiction, and that is worth celebrating and worth reading. Next, I have Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, a short late Victorian anti-imperialist novel set in the Congo, looking at the violence and cruelty that came with colonialism. This is another one I haven't read for ages, but it is really worth your time. Next, we come to Dinah Mullock-Craik, and I have chosen 2 novels by her. The first is Olive, which is the buildings roman, the coming-of-age story of a girl called Olive. Olive is born with scoliosis, so her spine is a slightly different shape, and she is told from an early age that because she doesn't look like other Victorian girls, she is not going to have the life that Victorian girls usually expect to have. She is told by everyone around her that she's not going to get married, she's not going to have children. And so Olive does something different with her life, and she becomes an artist. And we follow her through her life. We follow her career, we follow her love story, and we follow how she deals with the prejudices that she faces. And Olive is just so powerful and so amazing. It's a book I really want to reread, actually, because it's been a few years now since I read it, but I think it's truly wonderful. And I think it's really worth reading if you have read books like Jane Eyre or David Copperfield, you've read some Victorian buildings romance, and you want to read a slightly different Victorian buildings romance. And I think especially if you're interested in understanding Victorian attitudes towards disability, then Olive is really worth your time, as is John Halifax Gentleman, which is a novel about 2 friends, John Halifax and Phineas. The book is kind of about John Halifax in many ways. We're following his coming-of-age story, and we're following his rise from poverty as he works hard to try and become a gentleman. But this is all told from the perspective of his best friend, Phineas. Phineas is disabled, and again, the way Craik looks at disability in John Halifax Gentleman is really complicated and a much more nuanced presentation than you sometimes find in Victorian literature. Throughout John Halifax Gentleman, we follow Phineas and John over the course of their lives, and it's just a wonderful, rich, fascinating novel. I cannot recommend Craik's books enough. Okay, we now come to Charles Dickens, and I have put 5 books by Dickens on this list, which is more than I've allowed any other author. I think there are a few authors with 4 books, and then Dickens has 5, and that is definitely too many on a list of just 70 Victorian books, and I found it so hard to narrow it down. I tried very hard to be objective and not just put my 5 favourites. In fact, my second and third favourite Dickens I haven't included on this list. But I was trying to think about like what Dickens books would I really like say should be the ones that you read. Like if you're only going to read 5 Dickens books, which ones should they be? And I have picked out these 5. I'm going to go through them in publication order, which means I'm going to start with my most controversial choice, which is Barnaby Rudge. Barnaby Rudge is one of Dickens's least known novels. It is not a very famous book, and it's not a Dickens book that lots of people have read. But I think it is a must-read Dickens book, and I think it is an incredibly important book. And in many ways, I feel like Barnaby Rudge is the Dickens book for the 21st century. The last time I reread it, I was struck with how resonant it felt. Barnaby Rudge is a historical novel, so it's not set in the Victorian period, it's set in the 1780s during the Gordon riots, which were anti-Catholic riots that took place in Britain at that time. Barnaby Rudge is a long weaving story with a lot of different characters who are all pulled together by these riots in various ways on different sides. But the thing that feels so prescient about Barnaby Rudge, I suppose, is that it is a book about xenophobia dressed up as patriotism, and it's a book about how people tend to hate when things are difficult, and how damaging and disastrous that is. And I just feel like it's a really important book that everyone should read. The other 4 Dickens books I have put on this list are perhaps less surprising. I have Bleak House, which is, you know, by many considered Dickens's masterpiece, and I do understand why. It's a real favourite of mine. It is a fascinating dual narrative, half told in third person present tense. All these people who don't like present tense and say that it's really modern, please go and read Bleak House. And the other half of the book is in first person past tense from the perspective of a character called Esther. We're following all of these different characters who are drawn together by a court case that has been going on for a really, really long time. And it's just marvellous. The way the book looks at illegitimacy and the idea of the fallen woman is fascinating. It also has a really interesting mystery plot in the second half with a detective figure who is really important in the history of detective fiction, and in general Bleak House is just a massively important, massively fantastic book. Then I also wanted to put on this list A Tale of Two Cities. Now, A Tale of Two Cities is not my favourite Dickens book. It would actually be quite low down in my ranking, but I do think it's an incredibly important Dickens book, and it is, I believe, his most successful book, and the book that has kind of like continued to sell and be loved and loved by so many people. It's another historical book set during the French Revolution, and it tells us so much as readers, both about the French Revolution, but more specifically about how the Victorians thought about the French Revolution and how it existed as a thing of cultural significance within the Victorian period. It contains some truly fantastic characters, looks at some really interesting themes, and although, as I said, it's not my favourite Dickens novel, it does contain possibly my favourite ending of any Dickens novel, so yeah, it's really worth your time. I also had to include Great Expectations, which is in many ways the sort of quintessential Victorian novel. It's a buildings romance, it's a rags to riches story, it's a wonderful first-person narrative, which is often where I recommend starting with Dickens. It is in many ways Dickens' most perfect book, containing so many of his most famous characters. Great Expectations is such a truly incredible novel, and I do think if you're interested in kind of getting into Victorian literature, or you're right at the kind of beginning of your Victorian literature journey, then it's just so worth a read, because I feel like it encapsulates a lot of Victorian literature. A lot of the themes represent a lot of Victorian concerns and interests, and it's also, you know, a buildings romance, which is such a quintessential Victorian form, and I just generally think it's great and really worth your time. But also, I do have a fifth Dickens book on this list, because I couldn't make this list and not have Our Mutual Friend. There are plenty of other Dickens books that I think people will be surprised not to see on this list, like David Copperfield and Oliver Twist, but I just love Our Mutual Friend so much, and I think it is his best. Our Mutual Friend is not just my favourite Dickens novel, not just my favourite Victorian novel, it is my favourite novel, full stop, of all novels that I have read and probably ever will read, to be honest, because I'm so emotionally attached to it, nothing could top it. But also, it is a book that I know a lot of people love, and a lot of people get a lot out of, and I also think it has some really fascinating themes that tell you quite a lot about Victorian society. Again, it's a book that looks a lot at social mobility and people from various different backgrounds moving around within society. It's a book that is all about London and the Thames, and how so many different people are drawn together by the Thames. The plot revolves around a fortune that has been made in rubbish, whose hands this fortune ends up in, who this fortune affects. There are wonderful love stories in this book, but the darker themes are so complex and rich as well. And I just love Our Mutual Friend so much. It also has, like, so many fantastic characters. And this video doesn't need to become another video about Our Mutual Friend, but, like, it is the best, so I had to put it on this list. Okay, we're done with Dickens. I said I tried to be objective. I didn't say I had succeeded. Next up, I have two books by Amy Dilwyn, who is a really fantastic Victorian writer, very underrated and really worth your time. The first book by her I want to recommend is The Rebecca Rioter, which is a work of historical fiction set in early 19th century Wales, looking at the real historical event of the Rebecca riots. The Rebecca riots were a series of riots where men who were unhappy about the taxes put on toll roads protested in disguise wearing women's clothes, and this book looks at these riots and one particular young man who gets caught up in them. The Rebecca Rioter is a really fantastic read, but I particularly wanted to put it on this list because I think it's a really interesting look at Victorian Wales. I think when people think of Victorian Britain, they're often thinking of Victorian England rather than thinking of Victorian England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and the way the Rebecca Rioter looks at class divisions within Wales in the Victorian period and how different class divisions were when those class divisions were along language lines, when the upper classes spoke English and the rest of the population spoke Welsh. That's just really, really fascinating and gives you a really interesting look into social history. So I would really recommend The Rebecca Rioter. But I also had to recommend one other novel by Amy Dilwyn, which is Jill. Jill is a story with a really unusual heroine who is a upper class young woman who runs away from home to become a servant because she's bored, lies and cheats and steals her way into various positions, falls in unrequited love with the woman she works for, and simply refuses to follow the expectations of women in Victorian society. In this novel, Jill gets the kind of adventure story that usually only male protagonists get in Victorian literature. Jill is so subversive in such a fun way, and it's just an utter delight. Even though it's quite underrated, I think it's an incredibly important Victorian book. Next up, I have Sybil or The Two Nations by Benjamin Disraeli, a really interesting social criticism novel looking at the divisions between the rich and poor in Victorian Britain. Benjamin Disraeli, as well as being a novelist, was also the Prime Minister twice, which is just the most Victorian thing that's ever been. He's also a fascinating historical figure. Sybil is the only book I've read by him, but it is really worth worth your time, especially if you're interested in Victorian social history and class tension. Also very much worth your time is Gloriana or the Revolution of 1900 by Florence Dixie. This is a very underrated, forgotten Victorian novel, but what a fascinating piece of history it is. So this book was written in the early 1890s and is called, as I said, Gloriana or the Revolution of 1900. And it is a novel about a feminist revolution taking place in 1900, where the women rise up and prove that they can change the world. And it's not only a really powerful work of feminist literature, it's also a really plotty, pacey sensation novel with lots of betrayal and drama. Gloriana or the Revolution of 1900 is so little known and so good, and I just can't recommend it enough. Though many people have not read it, for me it is a must-read Victorian book. And now we come to George Eliot, who I think I might have earlier described as my nemesis. I don't really get on with George Eliot's books. Her writing style is not for me, but I do accept that she is a very, very important Victorian author, and she is definitely worth trying. I put 2 of her novels on this list. I'm sure someone else making this kind of list would have put more, but as I said, I tried to be objective. I didn't succeed. So the 2 books by George Eliot I have put on this list. The first is Middlemarch, which, you know, had to be on this list, didn't it? It's such an important Victorian novel. Middlemarch's subtitle is A Study of Provincial Life, and that is what Middlemarch is. It is a study. It is a work of realist literature looking at the lives of various people in a provincial town. It's also a work of historical fiction, so it was published in the 1870s, but it's set around the 1832 Reform Act. We're following various characters, their love stories, their money problems, their unhappy marriages, how gossip and local politics affects this town. I would be lying if I said that I loved Middlemarch, but many people do, and you might, and regardless, it is a fascinating look at small town life in the Victorian period. The other George Eliot book I wanted to put on this list is Daniel Deronda, which is probably the only George Eliot book I've really enjoyed, I would say. Daniel Deronda is a story of 2 very different people, a young woman who ends up making an unwise marriage and a young man who doesn't know anything about his parentage, and we follow their lives, how they intersect, and how they interact with other people. There's a lot that I like about Daniel Deronda. I think it's a really interesting novel in terms of the way that it looks at marriage and the position of women within marriage. But another interesting element of Daniel Deronda is that it features the Jewish community within Victorian Britain, which is not something super common in Victorian literature, and that is a really interesting element of it. And then we come to our last author for this video. I have 4 books on this list by Elizabeth Gaskell, and then I think we'll wrap this up and save the other 35 books for part 2. It probably is a little bit controversial to have more books by Elizabeth Gaskell than George Eliot, but Elizabeth Gaskell wrote more and also wrote a very wide variety of things, and so I kind of wanted to represent the various different things that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote on this list. Regardless, Gaskell is a very significant Victorian writer and one I would really recommend. She is one of my absolute favourite authors. I think she writes fantastically. One book by her I wanted to recommend is Cranford, a short episodic novel following various older, unmarried, impoverished gentlewomen living in the small town of Cranford. This book depicts small town life and gossip and a mostly female society in a really fascinating way. It's both exceptionally funny and very touching, and I just really recommend it. It is very episodic, so it's not going to be for everyone. It doesn't have a through plot, but personally I think Cranford is really worth a read. Then I also wanted to recommend Ruth, the story of a young woman who falls pregnant outside of marriage, and what happens to her, how she deals with the stigma of this within Victorian society, and how she ends up finding friends who look after her and support her. Ages ago when I read Ruth, I think I described it as Tess of the D'Urbervilles written by someone who has a belief in humanity, and I kind of still stand by that. Ruth is a book that looks at a lot of similar themes to something like Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which yes, we are going to talk about in part 2 of this list, but in a way that is more hopeful, and in which you see more sort of true human kindness. I also think it's a really interesting novel in the way that it looks at nonconformist Christian groups within the Victorian period. Ruth ends up meeting a nonconformist minister, and I think the way the book looks at sort of church politics and church versus chapel in the Victorian period is really interesting too. Then I have two other Elizabeth Gaskell novels on this list, her two most famous books. The first is North and South, which is an industrial novel and a sort of Pride and Prejudice-esque love story, looking at the character of Margaret Hale, who has grown up in the south of England but moves to a northern manufacturing town. This book looks at the poverty and class conflict that she observes there, the division between masters and workers, and ways there might be around that. It also looks at death and grief and religion and friendship and so much more. A bit like Great Expectations, I kind of feel like North and South is one of those quintessential Victorian novels that kind of captures Victorianness for me. I feel like if I were to try and make a list of like 10 must-read Victorian novels, if I were to attempt to restrict myself that much, North and South would be on that list. It is so good and it is so fascinating and it is so worth your time. But I also had to put on this list Wives and Daughters, which in many ways is Elizabeth Gaskell's masterpiece. Like, North and South is my favourite, but I think Wives and Daughters is her best. It is a work of domestic realism, a coming-of-age story about a doctor's daughter called Molly Gibson, what happens when her father remarries and a new stepmother and stepsister come into her life. It is a story about unrequited love, about gossip and scandal, about small-town life, about science and how science is changing things. It is a book about grief and about class and about family, and it contains within it the best created character in all of literature. Am I going to say that? Yes, maybe. Squire Hamley is one of the most realistic, fully formed, complicated characters I have ever encountered in any book. I feel like he is the most real person in any novel I've ever read, and that is one of many reasons why you should read Wives and Daughters. So there we go. I've been filming this for over an hour, so I'm sorry if part 1 is very long and part 2 maybe even longer, who knows. But there are 35 must-read Victorian books for you, and I'll be back very soon with another 35 must-read Victorian books. I keep forgetting to do the air quotes, but you can basically take it as read that when I say must-read, I say it slightly knowing that I don't mean it. There we go. Do please leave your thoughts down in the comments, though you'll have to forgive me if I haven't included your personal favourite Victorian book. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.